Hello, today I'm going to talk about Microsoft strategy. Almost all MobileIron customers are also Microsoft customers, and we as MobileIron are both a partner of Microsoft as well as a competitor to Microsoft, as are most software companies in the world. So it's very important to step back and understand how Microsoft's strategy is evolving so that I can help you understand where MobileIron fits in and also give you hopefully a perspective on how to look at the different technologies within Microsoft as you think about making your decisions around architecture. The first thing to remember about Microsoft is that in the end today, for the Microsoft today and the future, all roads lead to Microsoft Azure. This is the centerpiece of the Microsoft strategy. Azure consumption, I believe, is the central metric that Microsoft uses to determine how well it's doing in the market. If there's more enterprise workload moving to Azure, that's a good thing. If there's less enterprise workload moving, then that's a bad thing. And so you can look at the different actions that Microsoft takes, and in identifying where they might focus in the future, you can ask yourself a central question, which is, will this action on behalf of Microsoft or on behalf of you as a customer of Microsoft, will it increase the workload that goes in Azure? And if the answer is yes, then it's very aligned with Microsoft's strategy. If the answer is no, then that's probably something Microsoft won't do as much. Now, that's the end point, which is to take enterprise workload and put it in the Microsoft cloud. That's Microsoft's strategy, and in doing that, they also changed the business model from a perpetual licensing model to a subscription model, which is always advantageous for any software company. However, at the center of Azure is something very important, because all roads might lead to Azure, but all roads in the Microsoft strategy start from Microsoft Azure Active Directory. This is the core identity service, identity access management service within Microsoft. Now, most customers out there, most enterprises already use Active Directory within their settings, right, on premise. Azure Active Directory is the cloud version of that, and it's not by chance that when you migrate to Office 365, your directory infrastructure has to be synced to Azure Active Directory. Microsoft Office 365 acts as a forcing function to actually make Azure Active Directory a more and more prominent part of your identity infrastructure. And Microsoft has been very open about this. They've said very specifically that identity, they believe, is the central control point for Microsoft. So they believe that if they, Microsoft, are the authoritative source of identity for your organization, then that gives them a strategic part of the architecture, and it also means that it's easier for them to layer other services and sell other services on top of that moving forward. They're very concerned about losing their position as the system of record for identity, and so you should continue to expect to see Microsoft do more and more and more to have applications within the Microsoft stack use Azure Active Directory for a broad range of services so that the customer won't be able to move to another directory infrastructure. Directory and identity portability is not in Microsoft's best interest. So that's the endpoint, Azure, and identity is the centerpiece, and all the services sit around identity. But let's talk about something, and some of that's very familiar to people. Let's talk about something that a lot of people aren't talking about right now, which is what's actually happening within the Microsoft developer community. Because clearly Microsoft is doing very well with the move to Azure and the move to Office 365. But what has happened to the programmer? The big strength that Microsoft's had for years and years and years, starting from the early days of Windows and even before Windows, was that every developer used Microsoft services, right? I either wrote technologies for Microsoft Windows applications. I used Windows Server on the back end. Microsoft had the best tools for application development. That has changed. And the key question that Microsoft has been asking itself, I believe, is where are the developers going and what can Microsoft do to get them back? This is central to the Microsoft strategy. So if we look through each of the different elements of the stack that developers use, server side, we started to see over the course of the last decade, developers moving from Windows Server to Linux, right? And Linux became more and more a prominent back-end mechanism or back-end platform for developers to use. Now, what happened on the front end? So Windows continues to be an incredibly important front-end operating system for enterprise computing devices. But if you look at developers today, they're not building new Windows applications that frequently. They're building iOS applications, they're building Android applications, and absolutely they're building web applications. But they're not necessarily building native Windows applications. And then on the back end, of course, Amazon Web Services has been an absolute monster. meaning that so many of the cloud services now that exist out there have been moving to or have used Amazon Web Services as their core cloud infrastructure. And as we've seen over the past several months, Google now is getting very serious about the Google Cloud Platform, bringing in enterprise capabilities and enterprise leadership to be able to take that forward. So these three are really, really core competitors for Microsoft. Linux on the server side, iOS and Android and web, frankly, on the client side, and then Amazon and Google on the web infrastructure side. There's one other, of course, as well, which is also part of Google, which is G Suite, which has been traditionally less relevant for the large enterprise, but very relevant for education and smaller enterprise. And Microsoft fully realizes that if G Suite starts to get more and more pervasive, especially in education and so forth, that there's a whole generation of individuals that are growing up that won't be familiar with the Microsoft Productivity Suite. So this really is the core existential question that Microsoft has. The strength of Microsoft in the 90s and the first decade of this century was the developers. But the developers aren't building technologies on the Microsoft stack to the extent that they used to. So what does Microsoft do? What do they put in place to really drive this forward and try to get the developer back? Well, this is the third part, the third leg of the Microsoft strategy. Azure is the end goal. Azure Active Directory is the centerpiece and control point, and Microsoft Graph is the mechanism to be able to bring the developers back in. So all roads are built on Microsoft Graph. They lead to Azure, they start with Azure Active Directory, they're built on Microsoft Graph. So this is their strategy to win back the developer, and this is the set of APIs that sit in front of all the different Azure services so that developers can use those services effectively. And Microsoft has been very open with the statement that this is one endpoint to rule them all, which is very Lord of the Rings, right? But that's a statement from Microsoft, and what they're saying there is that Graph, think about Graph as the mechanism into all those Azure services, and this is where developers should be going to be able to access those services. So if there's valuable services in Azure, then the developer, of course, can access those through Graph. Now, what does this mean for enterprise mobility management? So what is the role of enterprise mobility management in this Azure AAD Graph infrastructure that I described? So let's talk here about Microsoft Intune. Intune has traditionally been Microsoft's product to do mobile device management or enterprise mobility management, with an emphasis, I think, on the mobile device management. Now, when Intune came out over the course of the last several years, I believe Microsoft viewed it as the heir to the throne of SCCM. So System Center, of course, is the dominant product for systems management for traditional Windows devices. And of course, Microsoft had a real advantage in that world because they owned the operating system. And so they were able to take that ownership of the operating system and apply it to the management layer as well. Now, Intune came out a few years back, and Intune struggled because it was immature compared to other MDM and EMM solutions out there. And so it didn't quite get to the point, I believe, that Microsoft wanted, where it was literally the heir to the throne of SCCM. And so what Microsoft started doing with Intune is it started actually adding capabilities within Intune that were not available to other EMM products. Specifically, what Microsoft did is they took their applications, their Office applications, and they opened a set of proprietary APIs on those Office applications to do functions like prevent Office applications from saving information in Dropbox, or to prevent copy-paste functions for those Office apps. So think about these as DLP, data loss prevention functions for the Microsoft apps. But Microsoft didn't open up those interfaces to the developer community. They only opened up those interfaces to Microsoft Intune. And so what that meant is that only Intune could set those key configurations for Microsoft Office apps. Now, this caused a lot of consternation across customers of folks like MobileIron and others, because customers said, look, I want to use Office 365 and I want to secure these capabilities, but I want to be able to do that with the EMM I have. I shouldn't have to switch EMMs just to get a couple of configurations for Office apps. And this was a big tension at Microsoft on what to do and how to do it. And what the customers were, of course, asking Microsoft to do is utilize the native capabilities that Apple and Google were providing in the operating system. Microsoft did not do that. They built a set of proprietary capabilities. They exposed those to Intune. What is changing now, and the reason that Graph is so important for this discussion, is that Microsoft Intune, as it moves into the Azure framework, starts to take on a slightly different role than it had before. It becomes more and more what I think of as Azure policy middleware. And here's what that means. That means that there's now an interface between Microsoft Intune and the functions it has and other external developers, whether it's MobileIron or others. And these functions now are exposed through the Microsoft Graph API, which was not the case in 2016 or 2015. So here's what that'll look like. This is still in process for us. This is new technology from Microsoft. It will, over the course of 2017, I believe, be made available more broadly. But I wanted to give you a framework for how these pieces fit together now, specifically in the context of Office 365 applications. So Microsoft Graph provides the API for MobileIron and similar solutions to be able to set those Office app controls that up until recently were only available to Microsoft Intune. I'm going to share with you now the new framework that Microsoft is putting in and how we as MobileIron will utilize that. So what I'm going to show you is work that's in process right now as Microsoft launches their new technologies through Microsoft Graph, and we as MobileIron look at the design of how to integrate this with the security frameworks that we have. So what does this all look like? Well, Microsoft Graph now starts providing the API for MobileIron and other solutions to set Office application controls. So let's actually take this as a workflow. You've got your device, and on that device you have a set of applications. These are personal applications you've already put on there, Facebook, whatever else it might be. Now, as you know, if you're a MobileIron customer, what you do through MobileIron is you use the MobileIron Enterprise App Store, which is called Apps at Work, to distribute applications, business applications, to that device. And on that device, those business applications have a set of controls that are enforced around them through MobileIron. And this could be because they're iOS managed apps. It could be because they're in the Android Enterprise Work profile. It could be because they're MobileIron App Connect applications, which is our separate containerization model. Whatever it is, there's a set of DLP controls, data loss prevention controls, that you put in place through MobileIron for those applications. Some of those applications will be from Microsoft. Some of them, most of them, will be from other vendors. But some of them will be from Microsoft. So here's the new part. Here's what's in the new framework that's evolving through Microsoft Graph in the Microsoft Cloud, which is Azure, which is now for those Microsoft applications, there will be an interface that MobileIron has to be able to set those secondary DLP controls. And then those will, of course, be enforced on those Microsoft applications. So what you have is a fuller closed loop here where there's DLP controls that you set through MobileIron that MobileIron applies directly to the applications, and then DLP controls that you set through MobileIron that MobileIron applies through Azure through the Microsoft Graph interface. In the end, from a customer's perspective, they have one place that they go, MobileIron, to be able to set those controls. So this makes life a lot easier for the customer because they don't have to worry about, well, can I access those Office controls? Can I not access them? And how do I get to them? So that's actually a much smoother environment for the customer as these technologies mature and as these technologies come to market. Now, from a Microsoft perspective, the Microsoft salesperson is okay with this model because the customer still has to buy the EMS suite. EMS is Microsoft Enterprise Mobility and Security, of which Intune is a part, as well as Azure Active Directory Premium and a whole variety of services around identity and security. So the Microsoft salesperson is going to be happy to sell you this. And whether you use MobileIron on the front end or something else on the front end, he or she doesn't care because EMS is still required. So this does mean that you as a customer would require the EMS license, but this makes the entire security model much cleaner than it's been historically because you have those additional capabilities or will have those additional capabilities to configure Office applications. Why is this important from a customer's perspective? The reason this is important is that EMM, Enterprise Mobility Management, is really hard. And now we have a coexistence between MobileIron, which we consider to be the best of breed enterprise mobility management product in the industry, and Microsoft's enterprise mobility and security product, which is a layer of products that I described earlier. This shift actually addresses the pressures that customers were putting on Microsoft to be able to actually integrate, to be able to be open to the ecosystem, and it also addresses one of the strategic challenges that any EMM provider has, which is that EMM is really hard. This is the critical capabilities for high security mobility management from Gartner, and we have the reprint available on our site. And they have 6 use cases that they investigate. This is the high-grade commercial security use case. And you'll see across the list of vendors here, there's a lot of vendors in the space that focus on security. And it is difficult. The set of functionality that you need to be able to truly secure a customer environment is very extensive. And because the operating systems evolve so rapidly, it's difficult. And the level of investment you need as an EMM provider to be able to achieve it is very substantial. So if I look at MobileIron, just in 2016, last year, we had 4 major products launched and 75 major product releases across the key infrastructure that we have. EMM requires investment. And as a best-of-breed player, we make that investment. And now, because of Microsoft Graph opening up, as those technologies mature, it'll be much better for MobileIron customers and Microsoft customers because they'll be able to use best-of-breed EMM as a single unified console to not only put in place all the DLP controls for non-Microsoft applications, but also the additional controls for Microsoft applications. Hopefully this video has been helpful in giving you a sense of how we believe the overall Microsoft strategy is evolving and how Microsoft Graph will continue to be a stronger and stronger part of this, and maybe most importantly, how that will allow solutions like MobileIron to interface through with Office 365 apps in a way that was not possible before. Thank you.